morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. I'm your host, Anlu Keeve. I'm the Economic Policy Analyst and Research Coordinator at the Institute of Race Relations. Today's webinar is on a very familiar topic. The state is more often than not, experienced as a hurdle that we need to get over, rather than as a partner in our progress. And in this way, the state can easily feel like a distant and immovable object. Today's publication, titled In Service of the Public, Reforming South Africa's Public Administration, forms part of the Institute of Race Relations' internationally recognized and award-winning Blueprint for Growth series. These papers are designed to offer actionable ideas to lift South Africans onto a higher growth path, one that brings jobs, opportunity, and dignity through work. This paper dares to look behind the curtain of the failures in South Africa's public administration. It explores a particularly provocative theme, the idea of institutional arrogance, the phenomenon where a public service that is designed to be in service of the public, as the title hints, instead becomes a source of the problems for the people that it is meant to service. We will be looking at how political priorities have at times superseded the constitutional mandate to put the people first. To lead us through these findings, I'm honored to introduce the author of this report, Terence Corrigan. Terence is the project manager at the Institute of Race Relations, and he's a veteran analyst whose work has consistently challenged us to rethink the mechanics of the South African public administration. The layout for today is simple. Terence will provide a presentation on the report's key findings. Following the presentation, we will move into a Q&A session. Please feel free to leave your questions in the chat box at any point during the talk, and we will address those at the end. Terence, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anlu, and good morning to everyone. Anlu very kindly referred to me as a veteran analyst. Now, whether or not I merit that moniker, I certainly have been in this game longer than I care to remember. And something that I can say is that when I started out in the 1990s, in fact, I walked through the Institute of Race Relations doors on the 2nd of February 1997. Make of that what you will. I remember on many occasions looking for information and having to phone various government agencies, departments, MEC's offices. And I would say that at that point, I probably received an answer from about 60% of those that I approached. Often I was just looking for numbers, pointers. There were people behind the counters who were able to assist. As time has gone on, that number has plummeted, and trying to find somebody willing to assist in these tasks, which admittedly are not key or central to the work of most public services, providing information to analysts, has become, shall we say, a much more challenging endeavor. I think that is unfortunately something that speaks to a broader pattern of behavior across the public service. Now, this is the third iteration of this paper, In Service of the Public, Reforming South Africa's Public Administration. Governments, which we understand by political office bearers, those who make policy, will come and go. But the apparatus of state is something that endures. In a way, I would say this is probably a much more important aspect of governance than who is at the helm politically. While countries, including some highly prosperous and developed ones, have been able to survive periods of chronic instability among their political class, governments coming and going in places like France and Italy, being unable to form governments. I believe Belgium had an extended period of that. With a competent civil service or public service, the basic mechanics of life continue. The roads are maintained, taxes are collected, teachers and nurses are paid. When those functions begin to erode, the consequences for a society are swift and they are disastrous. And this, I think, is one of the seminal challenges facing South Africa today. One needn't be in favor of a state-heavy development model to understand that the outsized influence that the state, the administrative apparatus of society, exercises over the workings of economic activity make economic growth, job creation, development efforts very, very unlikely if that state is not a functional entity. Now, this launch comes at a propitious time. The Public Service Amendment Act number 9 of 2020 should be 2026. My apologies for that. Well, no, actually, it is 2025. Sorry, confusion there. It was signed into law on the 1st of April 2026. So as we sit here about 28 days ago. And this was not an April Fool's joke. This is potentially one of the most meaningful legislative adjustments in South African governance history over the last 30 years, and I will get onto this in a second. It's interesting that this barely merited a mention in most media, whether we were talking about legacy media, so-called mainstream media, or in the sort of new podcaster and influencer space. Just keep this in mind. Something big has happened in South Africa. So what does this mean and how have we arrived here? That's the first big question I hope to address. Now, the public service, first of all, what is this? The Government of National Unity pledged the following amongst its various commitments: a professional, merit-based, non-partisan developmental public service that puts people first. This choice of words is not arbitrary. Much of it comes from the Constitution itself, but it's useful just to spend a moment dwelling on this. Professional, people who do this for a living, who are put into their roles to perform a job, no different from, let's say, being a salesman in a company or being a data analyst at a bank. Merit-based, in other words, people hold their jobs because they are fit for purpose. They have the qualifications, and they have demonstrated a sort of justification for having their jobs. Non-partisan, which means that it needs to serve the government of the day and also the people of the country properly, irrespective of their political views, their ethnic background, or whatever other qualifiers you may state. And developmental public service. Developmental, that's a word we hear quite often. The idea of development was once put to me, and I think quite well, that economic growth refers to the expansion of an economy. Development is how that impacts on people's lives. Now, don't misunderstand. Without economic growth, we do not get development. These two things, I think, are sort of Siamese twins. But as Anlu said, too often the civil service that we have meets none of these. GNU also pledged to build state capacity and create a professional, merit-based, corruption-free and developmental public service, restructuring and improving state-owned entities to meet national development goals. This is really a restatement of what I've just explained. But what I like here is creating a professional, merit-based, corruption-free and developmental public service. Notice the use of the verb there. This is not about raising things to the next level. It's almost like we are starting from what they called in post-World War II Germany, the Nullstunde, the beginning hour, the 0 hour. And I think it says something to South Africa's national condition, that even the government itself recognizes that that after over 30 years of after the political transition, 3 decades, and probably we're into now the sort of third generation from the generation that led the transition. We are now talking about creating the civil service that the Constitution embodied. This is not a good state of affairs. So the public service is about 1.6 million employees, national and provincial government, about another 348,000 in municipalities, and 216,000 in other public sector institutions. Here we're talking things like universities. And we spend on this equivalent to about 12 to 13% of GDP, depending on who measures it and how it is measured. But just bear that in mind. 1 rand in every 8 in the South African economy goes to fund the public service. That's neither a small responsibility nor is it small change that is being committed to it. Now, the public service and economic growth. Why is this important? As I say, one doesn't need to be a left winger or a statist or some sort of communist to understand that state administration underwrites the business environment. How well a government does its job, because governments have to do with managing societal activity, will affect and underwrite and support the business environment. There was a concept that came out, I think, towards the late 1980s, which was called good governance. This was developed in response, in an attempt to understand why particular jurisdictions, Africa being a prime example, despite having certain opportunities, despite having large amounts of donor support, despite sometimes having global goodwill, simply couldn't make that leap in a way that their counterparts in Asia could. And the conclusion essentially was that unless we could get the governance of these societies right, unless we could get their administration to function effectively, simply pouring more resources into them would yield very, very modest results. It also had profound implications for the ability of domestic business people to operate, which goes some way to explaining why we see in many African cities a very vibrant informal sector, but one which struggles to scale that and become and move into sort of formal trading. And while and why much of the continent's economy is based around things like extractives, simply because the resources are in Africa's soil, and also in relatively low value adding activities like trade. Africa doesn't do very much manufacturing, for instance. And the thinking is that governance, the ability to provide the infrastructure, the ability to maintain law and order, etc., is what you need to do that. Now, this was critiqued somewhat. Why was it that Africa was not able to was struggling to move forward, while many Asian countries, which also have severe governance pathologies, are able to do so. Corruption is not is not an exclusively African phenomenon. People who've got an experience of, say, India or China, or even some of the more some of the developed economies in East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, can testify that there is a fairly energetic culture of paying and taking illicit payments. Having lived in Taiwan myself, I know there was a source of it was a source of some humor. Well, what this came down to is, well, governance may not be good, but is it good enough? Can you get enough of the basics right, enough of the time, to make the environment good enough to operate in? Now, South Africa's constitution envisages good governance. That's the game that the government has talked since the beginning. We haven't even gotten, but the reality is we haven't made it to the good enough phase yet. So failings in governance have an outside influence on the ability of an economy to function, especially when it is more complex and value adding. Things do not have to be perfect, but they do need to be adequate. And South Africa is in an invidious position. We have a fairly sophisticated economy. We have value-adding industries, in some respects, world-class industries, but we are not able to take advantage of it in many respects, because government does not act as an enabler; it acts as a hurdle. So, how do we understand this? And there's been something said in the media lately about a new history curriculum, and I think history is a good way of approaching things. So, I'm going to look at three phases of South African public administration since 1994. The first, phase one, is associated with President Mandela, but more so, I think, with President Mbeki, who took on a very early de facto administrative role. This was the era of the transition, of creating institutions, which was accomplished reasonably successfully, but also it was the era we're talking about from about 1994 to about 2007. It was the era of transformation and ANC hegemony. This is a key concept to understand what has gone wrong. One of the first pieces of legislation brought in was the Public Service Act of 1994. In other words, this predates the Constitution. What this did was that it gave political principals, in other words, ministers and MECs, a great deal of influence over the staffing of their institutions. It downplayed the importance of the Public Service Commission, which had been seen as a body that might become a kind of overall guarantor of the public service. And this introduced what I would call a sort of structural politicization. However, it didn't stop there. In 1997 and 1998, the ANC launched its what I've on numerous occasions called the original state capture. Forget the Guptas. The ANC's policy at this stage was cadre deployment. It was to seize all levers of power within the state and society. And what happened in the state itself was that a party committee began to exercise undue influence over the appointment of people into the public service. In other words, those roles that were meant to be non-partisan, that were meant to be career-oriented, that were meant to be merit-based, became occupied by party apparatchiks. Some of them, no doubt, people of integrity and skill themselves. Many others were not. I'll just use the name Jackie Celebi, for instance. The man with no policing experience became the commissioner of the police service, and left South Africa with the ignominy of being the first country to have sent a president to Interpol, who resigned on corruption charges, for which he was subsequently jailed. Too often, people are simply not jailed. And those who look back at the Mbeki era with rose-tinted spectacles should remember this. Phase 2, Jacob Zuma, state capture, corruption, politicization. I do think, though, it's important to bear something in mind. Zuma did not create the situation. Neither did his circle. The tsunami had been building. He crested it. He took the systems that had been put in place. The idea of the party as the ultimate arbiter of constitutional institutions, and simply drove it to its inevitable and highly destructive conclusion. During this period, there were two major developments that are worth referring to. One was the National Development Plan. The other was the 2014 review of South Africa, South Africa's sort of 20-year history of democracy, which included a very big chunk on the public service. It was interesting that both of them identified many of the problems that had come to bedevil the public service, not least of which was politicization, not least of which was the use of state positions for patronage. In other words, when the decision was consciously taken in the 1990s to politicize and to assert party political control over the public service, it wasn't that something went wrong there. This was the inevitable outcome. And then phase 3. This is what we sit in now. This is the era where much has been made of the capable state. South African officialdom dialed back the idea of a developmental state for a while. It wasn't so much that it gave this up, but it started to talk in more modest terms. There was a review of the public service. There was even a document produced called "Towards the Professionalization of the Public Service." Also, a very revealing choice of words, saying that it's not like we're taking this to the next level. It's not like we're upgrading. We are creating professionalism for the first time. And if there's ever an indictment on the way South Africa has been governed over a protracted period, that's it. But this has also been a period of stasis. The most obvious thing to my mind has been that the president himself, personally, has refused to disavow Cadre deployment. In fact, at the Zondo Commission, he said that this is actually something that contributes to accountability. The disconnect from reality and the contempt for constitutional demands, I think, was really quite remarkable. But there it is. So we sit with an acknowledgement of the problem, but without a full willingness to take the solution forward. So the challenge, in short, was that the Constitution, the ANC's governance thinking, had in mind a state that was going to take an active role in the economy, that was going to push forward developmental agenda, that was going to be fairly interventionist. One can argue the pros and cons of that, but there it was. But to do this, it actually needed first-rate people. It needed highly skilled people. It needed essentially the best of the best. And it needed proper institutions, and these were not created. For myself, the state of our education system is always the greatest indictment on this. That we have a constitution that guarantees the right to education, which is viewed as extremely progressive, wonderful innovation, but we we are putting out generation after generation of children who struggle with some of the basic competencies. Why were these not created? Well, in brief, politicization, both structural, in other words, the way the law was written, the latitude it gave to political office bearers, and also the conscious decision to do so, done by the ANC's Cadre Deployment Committee, and I'm sure a great deal of kind of ad hoc on this on the spot politicization. One hears all the time, or one hears regularly at any rate, of people having been employed because there's a certain romantic or family link to the political principle. This sort of thing just can't be allowed to stand if indeed you want functional institutions. Poor professionalism has been tolerated. I'm sure that that many people watching can testify to a certain arrogance that one encounters in state offices. My own nightmare has been some of what I've encountered at Home Affairs. Now, I must say, there are my experiences have been mixed, and often that depends on the management at any given office. But I've been to births, deaths, and marriages sections where I've seen enormous conscious and somewhat callous rudeness, often towards elderly people who can probably not be expected to have the ability to navigate a modern bureaucracy, but very little sense of attempting to assist. More a sense of you come here and take what you're offered, or don't come here at all. A deficient skills based has compromised policy implementation and stable administration. This is particularly the case in the more high level functions, engineering, financial management, and at the and it's particularly severe at the lower echelons. The municipal systems in South Africa are not technically part of the public service. It's covered by different legislation, but the point holds. There's been a great deal said recently about the state of water infrastructure. A city like Johannesburg simply cannot afford to lose almost half of its water, but a lot of that seems to have to do with very, very poor management, with poor planning, and just not having the skills on hand or available through contracting to actually go and deal with technical problems as they arise. Let me just add here that I'm not necessarily advocating that a government should be responsible for all of the, let's say, technical delivery functions, but it does need to have the administrative capacity to understand what is necessary. Perhaps you can hire contractors, but officials need to understand precisely what the nature of the problem is and how it can be addressed. And then corruption became endemic. Now, I think that it is important to acknowledge that this was a problem before the transition. It's been a problem subsequently, but I think it has also been given a certain patina of respectability by the political choices that have been made, that have legitimized looking beyond the inherent strictures of the state system to interests outside. What starts with being the deployee of a political party and having to report ultimately to a party boss, I think very easily can tick into being accountable to an organized crime syndicate. It's in order to deal with this that you actually need a proper cultural orientation within these institutions. It's not good enough to say that we can pass a law. Laws tend to be reactive. Yes, perhaps I think we'd be far better off if we could actually put some miscreants in orange jumpsuits, but we need a system. We should ideally have a system in which public servants do not just don't go there as a matter of course. So how can we get back on track? Well, we came up with a suite of about seven points. I want to go through some of them here. First of all, we need to remove political manipulation from the public service. The Constitution was clear. This professional, merit-based, developmental. And this is the point at which the Public Service Amendment Act is particularly important. What that does is it removes that direct political influence over the careers of most public servants, and also prohibits senior civil servants from holding senior party political office. In other words, what this means is that whereas in the past, the ultimate hiring and firing authority rested with MECs and ministers, it's now been devolved to directors general. This is a very, very significant structural shift, and I think the administration deserves a round of applause for it. On the other hand, it doesn't deal with the problems as they exist now. There have been reports about, for instance, in the education department, civil servants or public servants giving briefings to the ANC representatives, not to those of other parties, and consciously trying to undermine the minister. That's the sort of thing that ultimately will destroy the whole system. And that's why I emphasize the need for a cultural change. What we also have to do, and this would be a bigger and more fundamental change, and one that I can't see happening in the foreseeable future, but one which we need to work towards. The Public Service Commission at the moment is simply an advisory body. What it needs to do is regain its role as the fulcrum of the public service. In other words, a body that kind of will shield the public service from political control. This will be made up of a small group of professionals. They would interact with the politicians and form a buffer to shield the public service, and also to make the rules and regulations that govern the public service functioning. There have been some legislative movements in this direction, which would do things like, for instance, give the public service more teeth, but we need much more of this as we go forward. And as I say, and I reiterate, we will see demand a cultural and also a change in ideological approach, particularly from the ANC. The ANC missed a major opportunity to create a world-class, non-partisan developmental public service in the 1980s because that was not within its ideological repertoire. If this is to work for South Africa, both the legislation and the mindset need to change. Secondly, good leadership and management. We've said a great deal about the overlap of or the intrusion. We've said a lot about the intrusion of arrogance into the public service, and that being the way that many people experience it. Well, much of this is less about macro policy and about cadre deployment, just the way that the systems work. So remove political manipulation over the public service. People within the public service need to be accountable to their own lines of authority. That's professionalization. Firmness, fairness, and high expectations. To join the public service, I think should be an honor. It should be something that is meant to attract society's best and brightest, a prestige career. Strict performance discipline and monitoring of consequence management. There are numerous stories, and this also goes back to the 1990s, of people being able to game the system, staying out of work for years, if not decades, on disciplinaries that just never become that are never finalized. That needs to change. People who are charged with disciplinary infringements need to be disciplined expeditiously, and that brought to finality. And also, senior management must support lower level management. Where there are problematic employees, this needs to be a junior manager should be able to take the necessary action and not be hung out to dry because a reticent union has gone above his or her head. And this leads directly to the question of organizational discipline. This is an absolute priority. No organization can function without clear lines of authority, particularly not a large one. Staff discipline, people who step outside the rules need to be dealt with. Whether that's a warning or a fine or dismissal or whatever. Firm but fair and expeditious. It must be done. Quickly and thoroughly. This also requires that managers be fully conversant, and human resources need to keep accurate records to assist in interventions. However, there is a problem that has come up again and again that there are managers who are reluctant to take that sort of responsibility and outsource that role to the HR department. HR departments, meanwhile, can themselves become fairly fearsome political actors, sometimes slow-walking disciplinaries. This needs to be dealt with. The role of unions. Unions are necessary. They represent a constituency, but the quality of unionism has been in decline. And I think that one thing that I'm able to bring to this sort of discussion is that I do remember 30 years ago, there was a great deal more maturity amongst in South Africa's union movement, even more so perhaps going a few years back. The public service is widely perceived as overpaid and entitled, and this is an area where I think unions have failed the country. They should have a vested interest in promoting professionalism. In as much as it's not their job to manage, it is also their job to ensure that that their membership and their constituency are bringing a full and professional and competent service to bear. Too often, though, union leaders be willing to defend the indefensible, up to and including things like vandalism. Now, this also, I think, comes to the question of how unions and managers interact with each other, and managers actually managing. Communication, engagement, very important, but managers are there to manage. They are not there. Unions are not there to co-manage. And this needs to be understood. Once again, there needs to be a cultural change. The ANC's alliance with COSATU affiliates has been a major problem. Going back to the 1990s, there were ANC documents that discussed how its new cadre of ANC aligned managers were there to drive transformation at the top, and COSATU would drive it from the bottom. The point is that there's a certain creative tension that must exist in that relationship, and perhaps this is only resolved if the ANC is willing to actually forego that relationship. Recruitment. Well, make the public service career a career of choice through a new system of recruitment. I would say that you would like that to be a badge of honor. You're a public servant doing a job for which you're well remunerated, in which you and in a job that you have achieved through particular merits and achievements. And this is why I would like to promote a system of exams for entry, for career progressions, as well as verifying qualifications for particular positions. So, in other words, if you are entering, if you are looking to move from let's say a clerical position to something involving management, well, you would need to demonstrate that. And the one thing that cannot be allowed to get in the way here is political preferment. Once again, this is about making sure that that people who occupy these positions understand their roles, are able to carry them out, and do not meet the public with a certain self-confident arrogance that they really have no business exhibiting. Capacitation. Well, we've talked about the lack of a suitable skills base. We live in a world and an economy where where skills are at a premium, and where it's simply wrong to say that, well, anyone can do this job. The positions in the kind of merit-based professional civil service public service that we're talking about is one in which highly capacitated people function well. Remember too that skills are not simply a matter of formal qualifications, but also of exposure, of mentoring. And I think this was a major mistake made in the 1990s, that there was a rush to change the demographics of the public service, and that took away the opportunities for new people to benefit from the experience of their older counterparts. And that is that is a problem we have never stopped paying for, particularly once again at local government level. Technology, once again, digitization, artificial intelligence, they all have enormous potential. At the end of the day, you need a human hand on the tiller, because the public service is ultimately about people. But if I think, for instance, of what a fully digitized system of staff records could do for disciplinaries, the possibilities are enormous. And this, of course, would require a well-functioning state information technology agency. So looking forward, let me just conclude. A reformed public service is essential to South Africa's future. This is not an ideological question, it's a pragmatic one. Legal reforms, but they will not be sufficient. We need to look at the political, ideological, the cultural orientations with which the public service has been approached, and new internal dynamics and operations. Managers need to manage, and the toxic practice of accepting mediocrity needs to be jettisoned. Properly reconfigured, South Africa's public service could make a significant contribution to governance, the economy, and to the cohesion of society. Something, a little note from the report, which I'd just like to conclude with. What is at stake is more than the competence of the state. It's about how competence can become an engine to drive the country's potential. A well-functioning public service is foundational to a capable state. A capable state would provide improved services, manage assets and infrastructure more competently, and both design better policy and oversee its implementation. Each of these would be a critical enabler of economic growth. This in turn would help to ensure that the reservoirs of talent in the country, both extant and potential, are incentivized to contribute to South Africa's wider fortunes. So thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Terence. That was very insightful. And I would like to remind our audience that you are welcome to leave your questions in the comment section or the chat box. We will have a look there and go through them. Terence, one of the parts that stood out most to me in your research is the description of the public service as not just inefficient, but as actively arrogant, at least in their relationship to people and to the public. And I'd like to stand still at the concept of arrogance for a moment. It's quite a strong word, but I think it captures the frustration that so many of us feel when we engage with the public administration. So when the public administration or the government, the state is perceived as the source of our problems and not the solution to our problems, to what extent do you think this arrogance is the result of the individual attitudes of those people in the public administration versus the systemic failures of the accountability between the different departments from a top-down network or system and their relationship to the communities? I know you've mentioned that there's a lack of accountability within the departments, but you've also mentioned unions as one of these changing elements in the relationship between public administration and the public. Where do we look to understand this institutional arrogance?
It's a system. An arrogant public servant is an arrogant public servant may be the function of his or her own character, but it can't be lost sight of that every public servant is also the representative and the ambassador of the state and of the particular state institution that he or she is representing. So it's the clerk at Home Affairs, it's the official in the council billing office, etc., etc. My sense is that we have a situation in which much of the public service, and once again, one shouldn't generalize to totality. There are many very good, very competent public service managers. As I say, I have encountered them, but if you are in an environment in which poor performance is accepted, or in which the system as a whole does not work, your response to any attempt to hold you personally accountable is likely to be met with aggression. I think that, as is the case with many large organizations, there are dysfunctions that happen behind the scenes, and the arrogance that we as residents or as citizens encounter is merely, let's say, the head of the blemish of that. There's, in a sense, very little that the clerk at the motor vehicle registration office can do if your problems have been building up with fines that you've paid and haven't been recorded. So better accountability is one. I think better accountability up the chain. I think also showing good, competent, and hardworking employees the respect that they deserve and to which they are entitled. And I'm speaking less here of what we as the externals should demonstrate, but how they are treated on the inside. I do think that there is something particularly bizarre about the self-congratulations that happens in a lot of government communications. You talk about the people first. Well, there's a phrase for that, which I think comes from the Mbeki era, "Bato Pele," the people first. Well, that's not the experience of a great many people trying to perform the basic functions of their lives. As I say, I return to this example. The manner in which I've seen elderly people, I think, probably trying to register the death of an elderly spouse, probably outside the country, sort of formal or urban centers, and being chastised by officials sitting behind the counter. In my own experience, trying to register similar things, and finding that there's a problem, but nobody could actually tell me what the problem is. There didn't seem to be any real interest in trying to identify, or any sort of ability. Call this a culture of passing the buck. I once heard that there's an American hotel chain, one of the big ones. The name escapes me, but apparently every employee from the lady who sort of sweeps the hallway up into the manager of the hotel is held to a contractual obligation that if approached with any problem, they have to resolve it to the client's satisfaction within 20 minutes. I wonder whether something like that might not be a pledge that could start things moving.
I would like to read a comment from one of our audience members, particularly to this point. It's from Fiona Semple, saying that I suspect some of the arrogance displayed could be that the individual knows they are not skilled for the job, but need to keep it no matter what. I've encountered some wonderfully helpful and compassionate ones, but they are sadly the exceptions. And she then continues to say that public servants who work hard and try their best under difficult circumstances are very uncomfortable receiving commendations for fear of threats from colleagues who don't perform. And I think that's quite a telling example of exactly the culture within the public administration and within many of the departments. There are some within the departments who genuinely want to offer their best to the public, but the bad apples are unfortunately corrupting the whole bag. Terence, you also spoke about the slow nature of reform at the highest levels. And it's particularly striking that despite the findings of the Zondo Commission, the presidency has refrained, or at least they've remained quite firm on maintaining cadre deployment and continuing with the practice. And it, as you've mentioned, it feels like they've reached some sort of consensus on the diagnosis of the problem, but that the treatment is very slow and it almost remains blocked to some extent. I wonder, given their refusal to abandon something like cadre deployment, despite the clear judicial and the commission their recommendations from the commission, what do you think is the realistic path forward? And before you answer that, I want to connect it to one of the very thoughtful contributions from an audience member, Diane Kruger, who said that her point is that please share your wisdom and input on the idea that all citizens of South Africa, from business leaders and community organizers to private individuals, bear responsibility to be part of a positive change. In your view, how can these different sectors of society step up to bridge the gap left by the failing administration, and how can they truly become the difference in their local contexts?
Okay. The first part was about, sorry, I'm just drawn a bit of a...
About the Zondo Commission's recommendation.
Cadre deployment. Okay.
Can I just, there's a connection for me in these 2 points, and that's why I put them together. And that is that if the solution isn't really in the works from top down, is there legislative pressure or community pressure that can be put on the government and on public administration to see the change?
Look, change crawls slowly across the Kalahari, as they say. Look, the cadre deployment, I think, is a particularly difficult issue for the ANC. First of all, there's the ideological commitment to it, the idea that they represent a certain, an advanced political and intellectual morality in the country is pretty ridiculous. But this is about self-image, not about anything that can be verified. First, that's the first thing. Secondly, you much of the ANC is held together by patronage. I think sometimes it is possible to over-ascribe to ideology what can be ascribed to venality. Thirdly, if that whole can of worms was emptied out, I think it would be mortally embarrassing. Let's remember something, and I've also banged on about this. The person who was in charge of the ANC's cadre deployment committee during the height of Zuma state capture, which is the one area where even the ANC will concede there was a major problem, was Cyril Ramaphosa. Oops, they just can't find those minutes. Now, let me just say for myself, I find it very, very hard to believe that those minutes don't exist. But I also really wonder whether anyone will ever see them. So I think that we will probably go through many years of, yes, we're going to do it. We're going to do it better. In fact, we've heard that again and again. The ANC will no longer tolerate this, which is interesting because it suggests at some point the ANC did tolerate this. And the point is, it's not about whether the ANC has the best chaps in the world. It's about the fact that the whole system is corrosive to the institutions that it is abusing. And my own fear is that even if you abolish the cadre deployment committee and you're not doing even this super awesome new look cadre deployment, it could still go on through personal connections. It just moves from having a meeting of the cadre deployment committee to being on a WhatsApp. So this is why you actually need a sort of change in the culture at play. As far as what we can do, unfortunately, because we are reliant on the state for some of what makes modern communal life possible. Think about getting a passport, for instance. You just can't get around the state. Now, fortunately, Home Affairs isn't in that sense. Getting you your passport is generally not. It's really not as bad as it used to be. As you go lower down the pecking order, communities and individuals just kind of have to accept for the moment that they are in many respects on their own. Now, maybe this matter, and unfortunately this matters less if you have the resources to either individually or collectively to step up, whether it's through an organization like AfriForum, do some very valuable stuff like this, or whether it's through a neighborhood watch or whatever. But I think that this is just something that collectively society has to say a very hard no to. If I look back at cadre deployment, for instance, it's interesting that for years it was, if not endorsed, at least kind of avoided or soft soaped by many very intelligent commentators. I think, for instance, of Richard Callan, who I would say is nobody's fool. He wrote a book called Anatomy of South Africa, and he kept on using the term, he was deployed here, he was deployed there. And I think that gave a certain legitimacy to what should have been seen as a very sinister process. And I think that that's just something that is going to require sustained pressure. Of course, are people going to do it? Well, the the other thing, of course, and I remember listening to the radio yesterday on Freedom Day, people talking about, well, things haven't worked out as we hoped in 1994. No one seemed to be pointing out, well, yes, but we do live in a democracy. It is possible to vote the government out if you don't like it. Maybe no alternative is perfect, but is there nothing better? If you are so desperately unhappy with the way things are now, find the least bad option and go for that rather. That's something that our political culture has not been fully ready to do. And that is a consequence that we as South Africans carry.
Yeah. We are close to the end of our webinar. I would like to read one more comment and one question from the audience. There is a general agreement that removing political manipulation is required and would be a positive advancement. I have a comment here from David Joubert saying, we moved from Rustenburg to Vredenburg, West Coast, a year ago, and the difference in service to the client/the people/me is like day and night. Maybe there's an answer in what the difference in service is for what needs to be done for the rest of the substandard country service. And I think this is a story that many can attest to. There is quite a bit of the service delivery difference between the provinces. And I think this speaks particularly well to the culture within the departments and how that influences the culture and the way that public servants approach their work and how they see the work that they do. Then, Terence, a question here from Stuart Pennington asking, given your views, what will the Public Service Amendment Act of 2026 change in the short term?
Okay, on the Public Service Act, Amendment Act, probably not a great deal because the pathologies are already there. The question is, does this sort of shift the Overton window? Does this perhaps give Directors General some sort of protection? But then again, Directors General are themselves politically appointed. Although, let me say they tend more than ministers and MECs to be in the public service space. And I think that also we are dealing with what has been a series of long-term pathologies. The understanding that somehow the state is the booty and the bounty of the of what was South Africa's majority party, and even that, as I say, I think that is to some extent been superseded by extractive networks. Whether these people carry a party card or not, I don't think that the national democratic revolution is necessarily front of mind. So I think we are looking at what could be an important first step, but it remains a first step, and it will not amount to very much if things are still being carried out informally. There's a proposition that is inherent to Africa studies or political science in Africa, and that is informal influence. The idea that you have what's technically called neo-patrimonialism. That's the idea that you have a civil service, you have proper channels, but the real influence is behind the scenes. People who may not even be civil servants or politicians, but are simply powerful power brokers and relate, and there are those kind of linkages that sort of overwhelm whatever formal authority exists. South Africa, I don't think is as far advanced along that as a country like, say, Kenya was, but it's a problem, and it is potentially a significant problem going forward. As far as seeing what we can learn elsewhere, well, I remember President Ramaphosa himself, so you must see what the DA does and how they do it better. I think it's probably words he came to regret, but danger of speaking off script. Intuitively, I don't think one necessarily even has to look at administrations controlled by different parties. Although I think that's a very, very important index, and I think the DA deserves the credit that it gets. But I think that we can also look at there are examples, for instance, of very well functioning Home Affairs offices. I suppose I won't be sued for saying this, but I think that the Florida Home Affairs Office, for instance, is efficiently run. And even though my experience, things could tip over slowly, the manager himself was walking around talking to people, explaining what the holdups were and whatever, and that made a huge difference. So yes, there are good people, and there are good examples. There are municipal governments that are not functioning particularly well, but speaking to the people there, often these are sort of technical problems that might be receptive to limited interventions like upskilling. And maybe the lesson there is that if you're out of the way and there's not much to steal, you do find people going in who are willing to try and do an honest job and to do it to the best of their abilities. In that sense, probably no one size fits all, but certainly I think we're a big, diverse country, and I mean diverse in the true sense of the term. And I think there are lots and lots of things that we can learn from those spots of excellence.
Wonderful. As we reach the end of our time today, I'd like to just thank the author, Terence. Thank you very much for your clear-eyed look at the hurdles and the opportunities facing the South African public service, and your insights on institutional arrogance and the need for good enough governance, I think gives us a very useful framework for the road that lies ahead. Also, a huge thank you to our audience. Your questions, I can certainly say, have highlighted that although the challenges in the public service are structural, to a large extent, the desire for a professional and an accountable state is a priority that we all share across all sectors of society. So the report that we launched today, In Service of the Public, it's now officially available on the website to be downloaded. And I want to encourage everyone to don't only read it, let's share it widely. Send it to your colleague or share the link on your social platform. And you can even use it to spark further discussions in your own professional and community circles. Real reform requires a well-informed public, and this is the type of document that serves as a tool to help us advocate for a state that truly serves us. So yeah, thank you for your time and your engagement and your commitment to a better governed South Africa. Have a productive afternoon further.